Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to our 5th Creative Climate Chat. My name is Chiara, I work at Julie's Bicycle, and for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, Julie's Bicycle is a charity working across the creative sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to catalyse climate and environmental action. Over the past 13 years, we've worked with thousands of creative organisations, other NGOs and policymakers in governments worldwide. We provide tools, expertise, training and guidance to build a new green creative ecology and empower the creative community to get out there and do what it does best, which is bring the full creative power to the climate crisis. Since 2012, we've also been the Arts Council's delivery partner for supporting national portfolio organisations in reporting their carbon footprint and developing environmental policies and action plans. If you want to know more, do visit our website after this chat. A little bit of housekeeping just before I hand over. So the conversation today is going to be recorded, which is why your microphones and videos have been turned off. If you think of any questions throughout this chat, please do use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window and send them to us. You can do that throughout the chat and we'll get to them all at the end. If you'd like to share any resources and links or thoughts with other people on the chat, you can use the chat function. So again, you can find that at the bottom of your window, click chat. Make sure that you select all panelists and all attendees if you want other people to see what you've written as well. If you have any technical difficulties, our colleague Ruby is on hand. That's the little window, the black window that just says Julie's Bicycle on it. Ruby's hiding behind that. And she's there to help you resolve those. Again, please use the chat function to flag any technical issues, but make sure you send those just to panelists. You can continue the conversation on social channels using the hashtag #CreativeClimateChat, along with the handles at Julie's Bicycle, at Zamzam MCR, and at SOS UK Charity. Finally, we are also live streaming today's session, so we'll share the link to that with you now in the chat box. Feel free to share it with others who might want to join the conversation. And also, just finally, before we get going, a little bit of a check-in poll. Thanks to those of you who already shared how you're currently feeling about a green recovery. We had a whole range of different responses there, from pessimistic and wretched to hopeful, slow and urgent. I think we're all in quite different places today, so hopefully we'll be able to bring all of those feelings to the next hour and the conversation with Zamzam. But just before we get there, I have just launched a poll that you should all be able to see for you to share with us during this lockdown, whether you've struggled to feel connected with nature because of a lack of access to green space, whether you felt more connected to nature but not been able to go outside, whether you've been able to spend more time outside, or whether you felt no more or less connected to nature than usual. Brilliant. Thanks to everyone who has come back on that. We will come back to your answers at the end of this chat. But for now, I would like to hand over to my brilliant colleague Farah and to Zamzam.
Thank you, Chiara, and welcome to everyone who's listening in. For those of you who've joined us for our previous Creative Climate Chats with Lucy Davies, Chaitanya Kumar and Paul Dickinson, we've talked about how the cultural sector is responding to net zero targets, intersectional climate policy making, a just green cultural recovery from COVID-19 and corporate climate action. Today's episode forms part of the second season for our podcast, The Colour Green, which is part of our Arts Council England environmental programme. And we're spotlighting artists and creative practitioners of colour whose work speaks to the interactions between climate justice, social justice and nature. So in the first season, which was hosted by the wonderful Baroness Lola Young, we spoke to artists Amma Josephine Budge, Zena Edwards, Kareem Days, and Judy Ling Wong. And you can listen back to that on our website and on iTunes and Spotify and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Last week was the first of the sessions for this second season, and we spoke to Raj Pal from a project called Colonial Countryside about his work uncovering the real histories of land, art, and memory. Today, we're looking towards the future, talking about young people and their incredible movements for climate justice. We're all aware of Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future climate strikes, but alongside her, many other young people have helped to propel the climate crisis onto the international agenda and public consciousness, and have made this an issue which is impossible to ignore. There's Lisapriya Kangujam, an 8-year-old activist in India. There's Jamie Margolin, Shutekat Martinez, and Isra Hersey in the USA. There's Leah Namugarwa and Vanessa Nakate in Uganda. And in the UK, there's Jessica Ahmed, there's Noga Levy-Rappaport, there's Maya Rose Craig and Alia Ali, to name just a few. They're supported by vast movements like the UK Youth Climate Coalition, Sunrise Movement, Zero Hour, the Child Movement, and of course, the National Union of Students in the UK. Their energy, their anger at the futures that they are being handed, and their quick-fire, holistic grasp of the interconnected nature of the climate crisis with other issues of social, racial, and economic inequality has been a real inspiration, and more importantly, a challenge to the climate movement to act with more urgency, with more creativity, and with justice at the center of visions for our new world. They're showing us what can be done and what needs to be done. And it's a burden that has been unfairly thrust upon them. And it's up to us to support them, to lessen that weight and to fight for that world. So we're really privileged today to be joined by Zamzam Ibrahim. Zamzam is the co-founder and president of Students Organising for Sustainability and the former national president and vice president of the National Union of Students. She's led work on tackling societal injustices, leading campaigns from climate justice, tackling racial injustice to abolishing prevent duty. Zamzam has been a leading voice on tackling climate injustice, more specifically in the education sector, diverting away from a Eurocentric lens in which the climate crisis is currently portrayed. So welcome, Zamzam.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction.
So just to open it up to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to work on climate and environmental issues, and when did it all start to make sense for you?
No, absolutely. So I think for me, I think it very much goes back to when I was, I guess, first elected as Vice President Society and Citizenship for NUS. The remit of the Vice President Society and Citizenship was was actually quite a wide remit, essentially. So I was elected with the intention of doing work around social justice, specifically around race, and really focusing on active citizenship, but like how that translates to people from background, essentially minority backgrounds, people of minority backgrounds, and but actually a part of the work that the Vice President Science Citizenship was accountable for was the sustainability department, and so at the time I'll be very honest, like I was very naive about the work that the sustainability department did. I didn't think it was. I didn't really see the correlation between it being impactful in the work that I do, and I didn't. And also, I felt like it was often the work that they did or the work that they focused on was so Eurocentric that that I almost didn't really encompass my life or my experience. And so but actually through the team being such a I guess a very open group of people who are very willing to critique, they asked me to sit down with them and critique some of the work that they do, and really challenge some of the work that they do. And it gave me an opportunity to really to really like put my hands into and really question the work. But actually for me, it was Asad Rahman, the director of War and Want, which I interviewed for a Black Students Conference, and the direct links that he made between like racism in our society and the way that plays out, and how that directly translates into climate change, and how that affects people of color disproportionately, not just abroad but in this country, and like how we linked it to sexism, to capitalism. And like for me, I just sat there, I remember, like I was interviewing him, but like my mind was going like things were just finally adding up, and like it was like somebody was like plugging in like things, and I was like, and like I tell him all the time now, that he quite literally was that light bulb moment for me that made me go, this makes so much more sense now. And I think working in this with the sustainability department, which now is a completely organization by itself, SOS, allowed me to be as allowed me to be as honest as possible. I was able to critique the organization quite constantly, and constantly tell them that this is exclusive of people of color. This is not completely ignoring the experiences of indigenous communities. It's completely ignoring the experiences of women, of people from people from like disadvantaged backgrounds. And so like the more I got to unpick the work that we did, the more radical the work became, the more exciting the work became, the more I was like, this is social justice work, you know. Because for me, the way and a lot of young people will say the same. If you'd asked a 15, 16-year-old Zamzam, like, what is why did you get involved in climate justice? Would you do anything in climate justice? I'd laugh at you, being like, I mean, I don't want to plant trees because I couldn't care less about planting trees when like my Black brothers and sisters are being killed on the streets, or being incarcerated in mass numbers. Like for me, at the time, there was bigger issues at hand. But actually, when you think about like the amount of Black people who are having their life shortened by air pollution because of the areas that they live in, to me, it was a completely different, I guess, a viewpoint. So that was really my light bulb moment, and it was an exciting light bulb moment because it led to some loads of incredible other things.
I think that's so important, isn't it? Like that connection, which I think the environmental movement sometimes, from my perspective, has not quite been able to make over the years, but like all of this energy that's coming through now, especially from young people such as you, has really been able to like grasp that and tell that story. And you helped to create Students Organising for Sustainability, which is an educational charity created by students and staff at the NUS. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work and why you think it's important to support students to take action, and what is the vision that you're working towards?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I have, I guess, a little bias because I've quite literally represented students most of my life now. But I wholeheartedly believe in the power of education. And like, not to sound cliche, but the reality is, it is young people, it is students right now that are going to be running the society in which where we were going to be growing old in. And so it is important to invest in them to be able to invest in your future. And so for me, I think, like one of the things that I know from a lot of the campaigning work that I do is that there is no point of sitting around and trying to convince a white middle class man that has lived a certain way his entire life to change its ways. I think the most important thing is you tackle any problem at its root. And so I think for me, this SOS, which is actually first a department of NUS, but actually it grew far bigger than the organization itself, but also at the same time, NUS represents higher education and further education. But I think really where we should be doing our work as students is really starting at a very young age, starting at primary school, making them understand the importance of the environment around them and the role that they play, and be able to change that and be able to influence that. Developing critical thinkers really starts at that age, and it continues on all the way up. And so for me, SOS was this incredible opportunity to set up an organization that does this here in the UK. But the thought point behind it was that that we are quite literally living in a global village where we are all connected around the world. And so SOS International exists, where we intentionally set it up with the students' unions, the national union in Denmark. We set it up with the national union in Ireland, and now we have several other members who have joined, on all the national unions that were joined in terms of their sustainability work. But the idea is to continue and replicate work that exists here in the UK, in other countries, but also to replicate work that's working incredibly well in different countries and bring it here in the UK, but also give young people a space in which they can politically organise, whether it's in their schools, whether it's in their colleges, whether it's in their primary schools. Give them the tools and the support to be able to do that, and also give them an opportunity to link up with university students who can then give their expertise and support to young communities. So I think SOS was set up essentially to really take our sustainability work further and faster. And in the short term, that time it's been set up, it's been an incredibly exciting time, because I'm working with such younger group of people who are quite literally dedicated and very focused on the work that they do. Like, for example, I work with a young boy called Joe, and Joe is has been like essentially the lead campaigner on the Teach the Future work that we do. And Joe is constantly on it. Like, when I say Joe, like we'll have a conversation, I'll have an idea, be like, maybe we should put these out, and then Joe will be on it within 5 minutes. He'll have like infographics set up. He'll have an email link set up. He'll build another part of the website, and it's like I sometimes feel like I'm working with these super kids who are just like far ahead of me, and I'm like, wow, you built a website? That's incredible. But I think that drive and that energy, like, is so energizing. It's really what we need to see, especially when like some of the answers that we had like literally a couple of minutes ago are like so pessimistic and so sad, when the reality is like that is the environment, like what we feel like. We're just a reflection of like all the negativity that is happening all around us, and so sometimes like having that hope and having that drive from young people is so incredibly important.
Yeah, you know what, I think that the world's in good hands with Gen Z. Yeah. And you mentioned one of the programs that you're working on, so I'd like to come back to that a little bit, and sort of dig a bit deeper into the conversations you're having around curriculum development in the context of the climate crisis. Do students feel like their curriculums are still fit for purpose, and what's the work that you're doing to change that?
No, so students don't feel like that their curriculum is reflective of what they should be learning, and I mean, we've seen that in the Friday for Our Futures, where thousands of students quite literally bunked school, saying, what's the point of being in school when school may not exist, or I'm not being taught or being equipped enough to be able to handle what's coming. And I think like young people in their masses have already indicated and showed that they feel like that the teachers and then their what they're learning isn't exactly what they need to be learning. But also, like, we've done research to find that teachers themselves, like 75% of teachers said that they feel ill-equipped to teach about climate change in the school. So I think one of the things that climate change has always been something that has been taught in like the silos. Maybe like you learn about it if you're lucky in like geography, or like it might be dropped in like a PSHE session. But actually, like, it's not something that is embedded into everything that we do. Where quite literally, like, environmental practice, environmental justice, for me should be always embedded into all the work that we do. And so that's where the Teach the Future campaign was born from. It was quite literally a response to the climate strikes. It was what a reformed curriculum should look like, and what demands we have from the government. So there are a few asked. I'll read them out. One of the first ones was that we're asking for the government to commission a review into how the whole English formal education system, from primary all the way to adult education, is preparing students to mitigate and abate and end the climate emergency and the ecological crisis. Number two, we want to see the climate emergency and the ecological crisis included in teacher training and new professional teaching qualifications introduced. Number three, we propose an English Climate Emergency Education Act, which will sit above existing legislations on education. on number 4, similarly to something that they have in Netherlands, we're asking for a creative youth voice forum that advises the government and local authorities, as well as colleges, universities, and NHS trusts. We advise number 5 being a national endowment fund to be established, to be led by a youth-led climate, environmental, social action work. And number 6 is around our buildings that we learn from. I think it's incredibly important, our buildings, not only do we learn in them, we learn from them. So we're asking for all new state-funded educational buildings to be built net zero by 2022, and all existing buildings to be retrofitted net zero by 2030. And so those are the asks. This is the first ever bill that has been drafted by young people. So this was a bill drafted by young people. We presented this in Parliament in a parliamentary reception and had over 70 MPs turn up. So we've got cross-party support for it, and we're continuing to push it. But I think it's something that's incredibly important and plays a huge part in actually the conversation around what our future looks like, especially our future in education right now, where we're quite literally heading into a recession, and we know that the only way that you come out of recession is by retraining and re-equipping our workforce, and that really means investing in education, investing in young people.
It's so ambitious and inspiring. It really those are really great demands. And you talked about funding and sort of re-education and retraining. There were some figures last week that were published showing that Black and Asian and people of colour working in science are almost half as likely to be awarded funding to research climate change, wildlife and other environmental sciences as their white peers. And there's a lot of conversation around how people of colour don't feel welcome in green spaces in the UK, and all of these are really tied together. And sorry, South London noises. All of these are really tied together into the same conversation, I think, and it's about those systemic barriers to engagement. How do we start to dismantle some of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it really links back to a conversation that I've had one too many times with a lot of organizations that I've been invited to talk about, and it's how do we diversify our workforce, or why is there a lack of people of colour in the environmental movement? But actually, the reality is, from my experience, actually there is ample number of people of colour in that field, and there is even a larger percentage of people that were willing to do that work and would work in those organizations. But actually the reality is, like, all of this is linked to systemic racism, right? And a lot of these organizations who on paper would like to employ people of colour make it difficult for people of colour to even be able to come into their organization. And so one of the things I think, like, all organizations, or even like anybody in the climate justice work or any form of social justice work, I think really needs to first of all understand the level of privilege they hold. Really understand the systemic barriers that exist within their organizations, but also the biases that they hold within themselves. And I think when you unpick that and start to understand that, then you can really become a better organization and move forward in a way where you're not disadvantaging people of color to be able to come and work in your organization. We know for a fact that, like, people of color are often expected to do work that only revolves around people of color. And so, like, I remember when I was first elected for my role as president, and like, I've done all kinds of work, but actually as the national president, you're often asked on education, but the one thing that most journalists wanted to talk to me about was either being a Muslim woman in a position of power, or the Black attainment gap, because that's the only race-related thing they can think about. And I think that, to me, that's just to me, that's really understanding that like, those are quite literally like racist tendencies, whether you realize it or not. The fact that you assume that this person of color should only work around doing work on like climate change issues. So I think like, first of all, it's an indictment on our British universities, that BAME I mean, I don't even like the use of BAME, because I
hate it.
I feel like it's incredibly important to break down these different communities, because they all have very different experiences in the UK. But I think, like, to even use that word, like the small percentage that are the researchers make up in our in universities is actually quite embarrassing. And then even when you break that down to females, that number shrinks even more, to the point where if you break it down to Black females, there's only 8 researchers in the entire country, like across like 132 universities. That's embarrassing. That's disgusting. And I think there's huge work that needs to really be done about tackling the race issue in universities, but also in society as a whole. Like, it really comes down to like being anti-racist. Like, we've seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the campaigns around the death of George Floyd really raised a lot of questions in organizations. A lot of people were putting out these statements of solidarity without putting any actions in their own organizations, and I really enjoyed watching people really calling out the organization that they worked for. And I think that's incredibly important, especially when white allies did that to their own organization, saying, you put a statement out in solidarity with the brutal killing of a Black person, but actually there are systematic racism that's based in our organization where our Black colleagues feel uncomfortable. What are you doing to support them and help them, and how are you changing, how we changing our practices in the way they exist? And I think that's incredibly important, because honestly, like, meaningless solidarity means absolutely nothing to us unless it's really backed by meaningful action.
Absolutely. Before I get on to our sort of last question, just a reminder that we'll be coming to some questions at the end. So please do pop any questions in the Q&A bit that you can see at the bottom of your screen. So I want to come back to climate justice and how it relates to all of these other systematic failures. And it can seem like such a complex and global and abstract thing. How do we connect it back to how our local communities and networks and our day-to-day work functions, and how we can engage with it in relation to our everyday life?
I mean, I think it's incredibly important, first of all, to understand how, like, the effects of the climate affect different groups of people. I think that's where you really start. Like, for example, the rise of like the EXR activists and the work that they're doing. A lot of the messaging that was around that is that we have 8 years to live? 8 years to live, or 10 years to live.
We've got until 2030 to make the
2030, so we have 10 years to live. And for me, I think it was important to understand what that really meant. 10 years to live really meant that it is white people have 10 years to live. The reality is that the impacts of climate change has been hitting and affecting people of color for years. For me, one of the first time that I understood the effects of climate change is when I was 14 years old, and my home in, well, my family's home. When my father grew up, my father's family were farmers, and they had their entire crops wiped out because of floods, because of mass floods that wiped out houses, that wiped out completely all the land that my father's family owned. And I just didn't understand, like, wow, like, well, everything's just gone. And I remember my mum saying that that's the effects of, like, climate change, like that's what's happening, and it's just getting worse and worse over the years. And I remember hearing that and just brushing it off, but like really having an effect on how that impacted me, and how that like how personal that was to me. And then when I got into this work, I think I more and more start to understand that there is, when I say a Eurocentric lens, I'm talking about, like, nobody talks about the effects of the global south. Nobody really talks about the effects that it's had on Bangladesh, and how houses have completely been wiped out. Communities, literally, as we speak right now, people are living without their houses, without the basic needs to survive. And so for me, one of the most important things to do is, when we talk about climate change, we reframe it, we'll talk about climate justice, because climate change is just an effect of something, and to me, climate justice is so much more important, because what it does is it centers people in the work, and I think one of the things that even in this country, when we talk about how air pollution affects people of color disproportionately, you only need to take the example of London City Airport, and how that was quite literally built in one of the highest percentages of people of color and working class communities right next to it. And there, since the airport has been built, their life expectancy has gone down by 5%, and it's continuing to go down. And that's quite literally choosing one life is valuable than another, and that's really showing how capitalism, the beast that is capitalism, is often what picks and chooses what people are disposable, and people of color have always been the first to go in terms of like who is disposable. And I think so when we talk about climate change, and when we talk about climate justice, and we'll talk about environmental justice, I think we need to understand and always reframe it around like, what does this mean actually to a person of color on the other side of the world, right? What does this mean to a little girl in Somalia? How's that affecting her? What does this mean to a little girl in Nigeria who lost all her home because of mudslides? What does this mean to a little boy in India? And so I think it's so incredibly important to realize that like we need to stop framing climate change or even climate justice in a selfish point of view, because this is a global issue, and actually the effects that the global West has, essentially the Western world has created, they haven't had to pay that price, and it's been okay for these big countries because to them those lives have always been disposable. So I think you can't really be an activist or care about climate change without understanding how systematically racist the work that work itself is, without unpicking it.
Okay. So what might a just and green recovery look like in practice, and what are some of the things we're going to have to be ready to fight for, and as the arts and creative community, what do they need to do to support that green recovery and a just transition?
I mean, the thing is a tearing down, like quite literally reforming and changing systems is going to take a lot, and it's going to also take a lot of admittance of, I guess, wrongful practices. And like the reality is, like a lot of organizations that do incredible work on climate justice often work with or are funded by essential individuals that are responsible for creating the problem. And I think sometimes it's like, for me, one of the most important things that any organization does and should do is really remain principled in the work that they do. And like that's really going to come with some difficulties, because that means cutting ties with the potential funders, cutting ties with individuals. I mean, I've been in situations before where I've worked with an organization and then realized that their funding came from oil, and we were quite literally doing climate justice work, and I had to cut those ties. Because that's, for me, I have to keep those principles, because there's no point of trying to fix a problem when you are part of the problem. And so for me, like I think the one thing that the sector really needs to look at is like really tackling some of the issues that you have within your own organizations. I know a lot of climate organizations who are quite literally supporting arms trade. To me, makes absolutely no sense. There are like quite direct parallels on the campaigns, and I think so I think for us anyways, on the question of green recovery, in order to I guess get out of the situation that we're in now, and especially around like COVID, like we have to create more jobs. We need to be able to boost the economy and really give different ways of working. I think that's something we need to be very comfortable with. One of the things that this virus has actually allowed us to do is understand that there's a lot of things that can be done remotely. There's a lot of things that can be to allow us to be creative in the ways that we work, in the ways that we educate each other as well. Like we are able to all come together and have this conversation and learn from each other like we could be a million miles apart, but we would actually learn from each other. I think that's really it's really had a huge impact in the way we do things. And so I think like one of the things I often talk about is reimagining universities. Like universities were set up to university was set up in essentially to teach in a very like binary way, where like one person stands up and teaches you, and you have the option to ask questions or send an email in, and that's about it. But I think for me, like we are in the 21st century, and there's completely different, like everything else around us has like changed, but our education system looks exactly the same. And I think in the same way, we really need to be able to constantly assess and question the way in which we work. So I'm just gonna.
Fantastic. Another reminder, if anyone's got any questions, well, we would love to come. We'd love to come to them. We've got time for a couple. But yeah, just I think the conversation around money and divestment is really, really important, especially in this period of time where a lot of arts and cultural organisations are really struggling and having to prioritise and shift and think about their organisations and structures in really different ways. I think Chiara has a question, so we'll go to Chiara.
Hi, thanks so much for all of that so far. I just wanted to ask as well whether you've got some favourite examples or projects, particularly around curriculum reform, of ways that have really, really worked to empower students to become sort of politically active citizens, because I reckon that's something that a lot of the arts and creative organisations that we work with could also learn from.
Okay, let me have a little think. Because we run loads of different projects in universities and colleges, so I'll have a think about which one my favourite one is.
We can
top favourite. We won't hold you to it in the future.
Okay then. I mean, I think one of our most simplest I call it like the entry campaign, because people really do it for the free ice cream. But when students move into halls, so we run a campaign called Student Switch Off. So when students move into halls, they are given, basically they compete with other buildings, and the goal is to be able to spend the least amount of electricity in the month, and everybody in that hall will get given like a Ben and Jerry's voucher to get some free ice cream. And it often is like an entry, because they start questioning about like the consumption of like electricity that they use, and like really understand. We train them to understand like why they're doing this and why it's important, and the idea behind it also is for them to break into a habit, because it's a whole month and you're doing something regularly for 30 days and you allow it to continue doing it. So I think that's one of my favorite projects, because a lot of people that I meet that have started that project were like, I did it for the free ice cream, and I'm like, I don't blame you. University is difficult. So that's one of my favorite campaigns, most definitely.
Brilliant. So starting small and with incentives.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. We've got a question from Rabia, which is, how do you address race within your creative organisation if you have higher ups that won't allow for change but might have sent out a statement supporting Black Lives Matter, for example?
Okay. I think for me, I'm in a first of all highlight that I'm in a privileged position where I've always been in an elected position, and by being in an elected position, I've always been essentially like the highest person like in the organization. And so for that reason, I've had that comfortability to call out anybody that works in the organization when I felt important to. But I think first of all, like, so the advice like I'd like to give is, and if there's anybody in the chat that can actually give better advice who's been in a similar position, I think definitely feed in. But for me, I think first of all, like, unionize, always unionize. Like, you always need to make sure that you stay protected, and I would never want to put a person of colour in a difficult position when they probably already are in a compromised workspace. But I think one of the things I'd highlight is speak to your colleagues, especially if there are people of colour in the organisation, but also speak to like white allies in the organisation. Sometimes those issues are better raised by white allies. That is why they are white allies. And I think it first of all gives you a cushion and a comfortable. One of the interesting things that I'm still really baffled by is why being called out is more comfortable done from a white person to white person than a person of color to a white person. Still trying to get my head around that, but that really is. That's really honestly a thing. So I think it's important to protect yourself in that sense. And to be able to, like, it's not right, but I think it like to be able to protect yourself in that sense, I think it's important for you to highlight that. But one of the things I always suggest is like, don't call the organization racist without being able to explain, being able to show what it should do and what it should do differently. The onus shouldn't be placed on you, but often, like, to protect yourself, it often is important for you to be able to give that and highlight that. And I think for me, like, I'd also reach out, if I was in your position, I'd also reach out to other organizations or like other colleagues that I know, different organizations, similar organizations, and get some advice and get some input on like what that should look like and how you should approach it. And maybe it just means like you'd be forwarding an email of something that happened in another organization, being like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we did this? This is a brilliant thing that this organization implemented, and like and it's real meaningful action to tackle like tackle racism in the organization. So yeah, I think that more or less answers a bit. If Barry, you've got anything to add to that, or like if anyone else?
I think networks are hugely important, and it's good to be able to get support from one another. And I think that advice cuts across to any sort of like social justice issues that you might be dealing with or trying to address in your creative organization. And it does link to the work that our organizations might be doing around climate change, where you might be, doing work around climate change or your carbon footprint, but not necessarily making those connections between climate justice and your carbon impacts. And that advice still rings true. You have to be able to be supported, to create a network, to find those examples from other people of how they're doing that, and to be protected. None of that work can happen without mutual trust. That
is very true, yeah.
So that's it for today. Thank you so much, Zamzam. And I'm gonna hand back to Chiara to close up the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Farah, to Zamzam for all of your brilliant insights, and to everyone who has tuned in, who's asked questions. At the start of this chat, we asked you a question about sort of your own space that you're in. And all of you on the call said that since lockdown, you've actually had the opportunity to spend more time out in nature. So that is definitely something to hang on to as we move forward and consider what we want the world to look like as we come out of lockdown. And I think also to some extent a privilege to carry with you that you have been able to take this time to go out there and go into nature. We hope that this chat as well has helped you feel connected to everyone else wherever you may be, and particularly encourage you to take a moment when the call ends to think about how you might translate some of what Zamzam has just spoken about into action in your work, and particularly how you can remain committed to the principles and the principles of climate justice in the work that you do and tackle those issues in your own organizations. You can keep the conversation going using the Creative Climate Chat hashtag, and the social handles, again, they're at Julie's Bicycle, at Zamzam MCR, and at SOS UK Charity. And sign up to the Julie's Bicycle Bulletin to stay in touch with future news and events. I think Ruby is going to share the link to that in the chat box shortly. From here onwards, we are moving these Creative Climate Chats to being monthly. in the first week of every month. So again, if you want to keep up to date with that, sign up to the newsletter. If you haven't seen it yet, please also have a look at the letter Julie's Bicycle has sent to Secretary of Culture, Oliver Dowden, calling for a just and green cultural recovery. We're still looking for endorsements for that from across the creative community. So if you haven't added your name yet, please do so. Again, Ruby will share the link to that in the chat box. We're going to collate the resources and a few additional links and send them round with a recording in the next few days, along with a very quick survey that will help us to improve these sessions. So if you could take a couple of minutes to fill that out, then we would really appreciate that. Again, thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you to Farah, thank you to Zamzam, and take care.